Welcome back to Instagram versus reality, the segment on the channel where we call out bad Photoshop practices and impossible beauty standards with science or just basic common sense. As always, these videos are intended to be informative and are not aimed to target or slander anyone's brand. This week's submissions are from r/Instagram reality. In this first picture, we have an Indian actress who posted this photo on her Instagram and talked about the yoga pose called Urdhva Hastasana, which translates to the raised hands pose. It's a base pose to prepare the body for more intense yoga poses. What boggles my mind is how yoga can help in bending the walls around her. If a base pose could have this kind of effect, I can only imagine what a more intense pose would be capable of. As you can see here and here, the walls are bent. The wall on the right side of her is contouring towards her body because she used the good old liquify tool. Using the liquify tool is a collective term we use on the channel, and generally it indicates any type of manipulation tool that can move pixels around, much like a thick soup. Generally, this is the most commonly used tool, and it's often the most commonly misused tool in body slimming and face adjustments. If you zoom in quite a bit more to her right thigh near the thigh gap, it's a straight line, which is really odd where you'd expect it to be curved just like it is on the other side. Perhaps she used the tool here or just cut out that portion and replaced it with the background. It's likely that she did this from her phone and not in Photoshop, as one could easily freeze the background and then morph the body to their liking. In a picture like this, it's easier to cut out the subject from the background because the picture is of low quality and it's going to lose even more detail when you post it on Instagram. Morphing the photo as two composite images will help retain a lot more of that detail and avoid negative blur zones. We used a similar approach in a previous episode, so you can refer to that for the full process. The second example comes from e-commerce giant Shein. They've been caught multiple times in the past with bad Photoshop examples, even on this very channel. But in this example, the retouching on the model looks quite good in terms of color, pores, skin texture, and proportions, but even though they got all of the details right, they somehow missed the bendy, liquid mirror from the matrix right behind her. You can also see that the reflection of the door is just not straight. If you can't spot it, you can check by dragging out a guide to see if the mirror is straight, and it's definitely not. So to fix it, you can go to the necessary evil that is the liquify tool. Just like in the previous example, we can drag a guide out and align the mirror and the reflection with the guide itself. It's a straightforward example of liquify misuse, but the fact that the editors missed the mirror in the background is just very sloppy work. Moving on, this next one was pretty strange to me. We have Britney Spears and you can clearly see, well, not clearly, it is quite subtle actually, but the photo was retouched and morphed. The doors behind her bend towards Britney's contour, so much so that it's bending towards her waist. Honestly, I really don't see the point of her slimming her waist down here because she's wearing a loose shirt anyway. As you may know from previous episodes, when you try to contour loose-fitting clothing, it just creates a very obvious vacuum effect. Some commenters from the Instagram reality subreddit were talking about how her left pant leg did not have any wrinkles, but it's much higher than her right leg. It could just be that she folded her left leg to be higher than the other, so I disagree that she edited anything in that region. This is what happens when you know something is wrong with the picture, but you keep looking for flaws to see things that aren't there. That's why it's a good idea while you're working on a picture to take a break from your computer and come back to look for the things that you might have overdone or missed. As any visual artist can tell you, overexposure fatigue can make you lose sight of the bigger picture and is how most of these subtle editing flaws can pass through. Now, to align or fix the door behind her, you can once again use the guides to have a frame of reference of where the door frame should be. Then you can use the liquify tool to simply fix the distortions. On her left side, it was morphed way too much and there's not enough digital information for us to get back. If I were to correct this with the liquify tool, it would just blur out the image even more and make it more noticeable. Instead, the proper way would be just to redraw the image by taking a rough guess on what it should look like. This fourth example is pretty extreme, and at this point, I can't tell if it's serious or a joke. Whoever edited this picture just gave her a uniform skin tone. Let's take a look at what a good example should look like. As seen here, you can see in the retouched and in the original picture, there's a variation of colors in the highlights. It goes from dark to light and then gradually to dark again, and in the middle there's tones and shadows. There's even darker colors and a little bit more variation towards the end. Because of this, we have varying skin tones like reddish cheeks and more pale on the sides or on the forehead. But in the badly done example, the editor just painted the body in one color and then masked out the eyes, teeth and mouth, for which I'm guessing they also increased the contrast because it just looks unnaturally white. There are some details, like at the knees there's a bit of shadow, but that's not enough because the face is just strange. So to correct this, we need to consider a few things. You can see on her face it's almost the same color, from forehead to her nose and across the face, so we need to introduce tones, shadows, highlights and contrast. This is very difficult to fix because we don't have the original image, where if we did, it would just make more sense to edit it properly right from the beginning. Instead, the best way to simulate what she would look like is to take a color that is fairly darker than the skin tone that she currently has and use that layer as soft light, decrease the opacity and erase out the parts to give an idea of depth. Part of the reason why this face looks so uncanny is because it lacks natural creases and lines like the nasolabial line, so we're going to have to draw those back in. This does give us more artistic freedom rather than realism because we're creating depth on the picture where there wasn't any. Finally, to give it even more depth, we can paint some highlights and then blur out the layer using Gaussian blur and lower the opacity. You can start to see some of her face taking shape with three-dimensionality because before it was flat monotone. To add some porosity in the skin, we can use a grey layer, add some noise to it and apply an inverse mask and then use that noise as the skin texture and then blur it in just a little to match the quality of the background and the image itself. For posterity, let's look at another example of skin retouching. This one is a bit less extreme and they've done a fairly decent job using a technique called frequency separation, in which you separate the skin tone and color from the texture and graininess of the image. The issue is, she didn't apply the frequency separation to the regions that actually needed it, instead going for a shotgun one-size-fits-all approach, which has the unwanted effect of blurring out her cleavage and leaving no shadows behind. It is much better edited than the previous example, and you can still see the detail in the skin, if only she hadn't missed the one obvious flaw. Now to fix it, you can create a path along her chest and then select a darker skin tone and then paint the shadow in. Finally, mask out the rest of it and then blur it a little just to give it a bit of realism to match the background. Bad Photoshop skills isn't unique to one gender. Guys can get it very, very wrong as well. In this example, the skin has no texture and just looks smooth as a baby's bottom. As far as color goes, it is quite good that there's a lot of variation from the skin tones in the highlights and shadows, but having no skin texture is a very big giveaway. Editing skin texture is very difficult to get right because there's so many nuances to it that we've covered in the previous videos. For instance, skin texture contours around eyes and forehead in completely different ways to how it would with the cheeks or chin. The pores and blemishes that make up our skin move and stretch in very different ways in different parts of the face, and this is what gives us our color contrast as light reflects in very irregular ways. Another issue is, in our face, as we smile or show any expression, the pores and skin texture move around and form natural lines and creases, without which we would just look like computer sims. This is part of the Uncanny Valley effect, which we covered in great depth on our video here, and the term was coined in 1970 and suggests that whenever you see anything resembling a human or any computer generated face, there comes a point where it gives off a very strange feeling that makes you feel uncomfortable, like you can relate to it, but you also can't. In this final example, there was some debate about her changing her skin tone in the comments section, like making herself look more pale, but it's likely that's her natural skin color because you can see in her arms and in her hands that it's quite uniform. This picture is of Norwegian singer Aurora, who has naturally pale skin. The only thing that's disconcerting in her face is that she has a perfectly straight jaw and a pointy chin. Once again, this is part of what adds to the uncanny effect, where even if you have a strong jawline, there are still some sort of irregularity in your skin, which makes even the most perfect of jaws look irregular. We can make it look more like her original photo by using the liquify tool and a freeze mask on the lips and just slowly dragging it to make the jaw look more natural and not so straight and pointy like an arrowhead. Another thing that's quite off about this picture is that her eyes are too big and not proportionate. Although they're off by just a slight margin, one way of adjusting the eye shape and many other features is by using the Face Aware tool in the Liquify Tools options, which uses Adobe Sensei, which is a Photoshop AI that's trained to detect faces and landmarks from the background. Alright, that brings another episode to a close. Hopefully you learned something about the Photoshop techniques. We've covered almost everything here in greater depth in a previous video, somewhere along in the series. As always, if you're enjoying the content, then you can really support the channel by subscribing and click the notification bell to catch the future episodes.